There are many ways to do yoga. In this practice, I'm giving you tips on what works for me. Clearly, if other things work for you, just discard these ideas. I have taught for many years and watch students in various poses. It's created for me a perfect do's and don'ts list for my own practice at home. We'll be doing a variety of poses. We'll discover some misalignments that occur very frequently. The best thing you can do is find a teacher who will refine your alignments in person. Maybe some of these tips will help you in your own home practice. Let's start on our bellies for Bhujangasana or Cobra pose, a pose that you'll find in almost every yoga class you go to. So as you come to your belly, place your hands right alongside your ribs. Press your toenails down and just pulse up with the breath and soften down. Now, notice that the arms are not doing too much work when the elbows are bent. You're pressing the base of the fingers down, especially the base of your index finger. You're pulling the hands isometrically in toward each other, and you're just pulsing up and down. One of the most common misalignments I see is people straightening their arms and just really sacrificing the alignment of their shoulders and their low back. So as you keep your elbows bent, it allows your back muscles to do more work. It allows you to strengthen your back muscles as you pulse up and down. You're pressing the tip tops of the fingers, pressing the base of the fingers. You're not dumping all your weight to the wrist like you would in straight arms, and you're keeping the heads of the arm bones back to really get that strength in the back and openness in the front and come up to all fours position. So that's Bhujangasana or Cobra pose. Now let's come to downward facing dog, another pose that you'll find in almost all classes. What I find in downward facing dog is that people really want to get their heels on the mat. And for many bodies, that's great. That works perfectly. But for a lot of our bodies, that doesn't work so well. So let's come to the belly again and place the hands right alongside your ribs again. And as you come to all fours position on your way to downward facing dog with your toes tucked under, you see that your hands are not right under your shoulders for most of us. Lift your knees up off the floor. And as you come to downward facing dog, just get a nice length in your spine. Now, for many people that are just beginning, they really need to bend their knees to get the sit bones to lift. So I like to do that in every time that I practice. Bend the knees, lift the sit bones, and from there, draw your heels down toward the mat. Come back to all fours position. There's a full explanation of the correct alignment and hand placement and downward facing dog in another video, and I'll leave the link on that in the description. Another misconception, maybe misalignment that I often see is when you are in a standing pose and you step wide. Wide is a very ambiguous term, I've noticed. And as you probably know, if you lift your arms up, one of the unwritten rules, or maybe it's written down, but one of the rules in yoga is if you were to have a string on your wrist, would it then be roughly down to the ankles? And for many of us, that's a really wide stance. See if you can widen your stance a lot because we see a lot of very short, wide stances when you go into some poses, such as triangle pose, when you turn the right toes out and you take your hand down toward your leg. You don't get the full benefit, and the pose is a little bit more difficult to accomplish than if you have a nice wide stance and you come to the form of the pose. So let's try that. So in your wide stance, turn your right toes out, draw your right hand down to the shin bone. Take the lifted arm to your waist. And again, we have another video just refining this pose a lot. But so many people just go a little bit too far and therefore collapse the underside ribs. It's better to keep the length of the right side ribs in your pose and lift up your right hand a little bit higher. Inhale, lift up, come to the opposite side and just try it in this wider stance. Keep your legs very active and your feet pulling in, a nice alignment from the heel to the back arch as you draw over. And again, not too far because you'll collapse the underside ribs. Just lift your hand up and open your chest, take your gaze up and root down to inhale and rise up. Release your hands. In almost all yoga practices, we do Virabhadrasana 1 and Virabhadrasana number 2, or Warrior 1 and Warrior 2. And sometimes the teacher or the sequence links Virabhadrasana 1 with Virabhadrasana 2. Many people have hips that can open up so easily like that. I don't. That transition from Virabhadrasana number 1, which is called a closed hip position, the top of the pelvis, I'm calling the pelvic point. And when your pelvic points are parallel to the short edge of the mat, and you're coming to Virabhadrasana 1 by bending your knee to take your arms up. You just open the chest really nicely. Release your hands. And now, if you were to go to an open hip from the closed hip, where the hip points are pointed toward the front edge of the mat, to the open hip, for many of us, we really have to adjust our stance for this pose to have this nice wide stance that Virabhadrasana number 2 has. You have to really adjust. Let's try that on the other side so you can see more clearly in your own practice from one side to the other. As you start in this closed hip pose, where the hip points are pointed toward the short edge of the mat and bend your knee. Try to keep your heel down, but if it requires you to lift your heel slightly, that's fine. You come to Virabhadrasana 1. Now you release your hands and come to that wide stance again. So you come to Virabhadrasana 2. Release. Now step your feet to Tadasana. So the reason I don't recommend going from this closed hip pose to an open hip pose is that it's very difficult for many of us to do the transition. Again, if you can do that transition easily, great. But I prefer doing all your closed hip poses like Parsvottanasana, Virabhadrasana, your lunges first to really open up the hips before doing a sequence in the open hip position. Another point that's worth making in the kind of do's and don'ts is in forward bends. So often I'll see people with locked knees rounding to try to get as close as possible to the floor. And instead, we want to keep the alignment, the length, the elongation of the spine. And if you just come down with slight bend to the knees, As you come down, you keep this nice alignment of the spine, and you're able to work your legs a little bit more without making any sacrifices and shortening the spine. So, if you can train yourself to just kind of find that spot where you can get the length in the spine without the roundedness. Of course, some of you that are advanced students, you can keep that length to go much deeper into Uttanasana, this standing forward bend. And in the same way, when you come to sit, and I always like sitting again, this is my preference, just with a little elevation. When you come to sit and do essentially the same pose that we were doing, you come to sit, you sit tall. As you come forward, you start to notice once again, you get this pulling sensation on the backs of the knees. You get a rounding sensation in the back, so you're shortening your spine as you draw down. Rather than rounding the spine, keep the length. You can bend your knees just slightly. Allow yourself to keep the length in the spine and draw the heart forward rather than taking the nose down. And again, it's your practice, but the Hatha Yoga really encourages us to get as much strength and length in the spine as possible. It may not feel quite so fulfilling to come forward with the knees slightly bent, but you'll find that over time you'll have fewer injuries and you'll start to train the muscles to come into a deeper expressions of the pose with alignment. So there you have it. Just a few tips, some do's and don'ts in your practices so that you can get deeper and deeper into your poses over time. Namaste.